The red emergency lights of the Obsidian Spire pulsed like the dying heart of a giant. Every 3 seconds, the corridors were washed in a crimson hue that made the chrome walls look as if they were bleeding. Silas Thorne leaned against the cold bulkhead, his lungs burning with each ragged breath. He could taste the ozone and the metallic tang of discharged plasma in the recycled air. His chest felt heavy, not just from the exertion of running through 3 levels of a high-security containment wing, but from the physical weight of the neural harmonic bridge embedded at the base of his skull. It felt like a freezing needle was permanently jammed into his spine, vibrating with a frequency that threatened to shatter his teeth. "Move, Silas," he told himself, though his legs felt like they were made of lead. "If you stay here, you're just a target for the scrap heap." Beside him, Vespera moved with a grace that felt predatory and ethereal at the same time. Her skin, the color of starlight on deep water, seemed to shimmer even in the dim light. She didn't breathe hard. She didn't sweat. She simply watched the corridor ahead, her eyes glowing with a faint cobalt intensity. In her hand, she held a singularity blade, a hilt of dark obsidian from which a blade of warped space-time flickered in and out of existence. To the thalassic sovereignty, she was weapon prime. To Silas, she was currently the only reason he was still a living, breathing human being. "Wait," Vespera said. Her voice wasn't a sound made by vocal cords. It was a ripple in his mind, clear and cold as a mountain stream. 3 units approaching. Heavy armor. Pulse rifles. Silas wiped a smear of blood from his forehead. "Great. Just great. I thought you said this route was a ghost run." "The plan changed when the High Overseers authorized lethal force," she replied, her gaze never wavering. "They no longer care about preserving the host. They only want to terminate the anomaly." The anomaly. That was him. A human scavenger who had survived the bonding process for 45 days, 3 hours, and 12 minutes. No one else had lasted more than a week. The previous candidates, alien nobles, hardened war criminals, genetically enhanced soldiers, had all flatlined or gone completely brain-dead within 100 hours of being linked to her. Silas checked his sidearm, a battered kinetic pistol he had swiped from a fallen guard. He only had 5 rounds left. "Well, sweetheart, if they want to scrap us, they're going to have to work for it. Let's bug out through the ventilation shafts." The airlock at the end of the hall hissed open. 3 armored sovereignty enforcers stepped through, their visors reflecting the red strobe of the alarms. They moved with the terrifying synchronicity of a hive mind. "Sector 6B, target identified," the lead enforcer announced, his voice a mechanical drone. "Terminate the human. Contain the Xylari." Silas didn't wait for them to aim. He dove behind a heavy cargo crate, the impact jarring his shoulder. He popped up and fired 2 rounds. The kinetic slugs sparked off the enforcer's energy shields, doing little more than drawing their attention. "Damn it," Silas hissed, ducking back down as a bolt of blue plasma vaporized the corner of his cover. "These squids don't know when to quit." Vespera didn't hide. She stepped into the center of the corridor, her silver hair flowing behind her like a solar flare. The enforcers turned their weapons toward her, but before they could squeeze their triggers, she moved. It wasn't running. It was a blur of motion that defied the laws of physics. She crossed the 15 meters of the hallway in less than half a second. The singularity blade hissed through the air, leaving a trail of distorted light. The first enforcer didn't even have time to scream. The blade passed through his shield and his armor as if they were made of mist. He collapsed, his physical form folding into a localized gravity well before dissipating into nothingness. Vespera spun, her movements a lethal dance, and disarmed the second guard with a kick that sent his rifle flying into the ceiling. Silas watched from behind the crate, his eyes wide. Even after weeks of living in the same room as her power still terrified him. But it was more than just fear now. Through the bridge in his mind, he could feel a faint echo of her emotions. It wasn't the cold killing machine the sovereignty thought she was. She was tired. She was desperately, anciently tired of being a monster. "Vespera, get down!" Silas shouted. The third enforcer had recovered and pulled a backup disruptor. He aimed it directly at the base of Vespera's neck, the site of her control collar. Silas leaped from his cover, not thinking about the odds or the fact that he was just a fragile bag of bones and blood. He tackled the enforcer just as the disruptor fired. The beam went wild, melting a hole in the ceiling. Silas and the armored soldier crashed to the floor. The enforcer was twice his size and encased in powered plates. But Silas had spent 20 years brawling in the lower decks of freighter ships. He jammed his thumb into the gap of the soldier's helmet and pulled the release. The helmet hissed open, revealing a pale, hairless face with multiple eyes. "Eat this, you overcooked piece of sushi," Silas snarled, slamming his fist into the alien's jaw. The soldier went limp. Silas scrambled to his feet, his hand shaking as he gripped his pistol. He looked over at Vespera. She was standing over the remaining unconscious enforcer, her blade humming. She looked at Silas, her cobalt eyes searching his face. "You interfered," she said. "You could have been killed." "Yeah, well, I've got a bad habit of staying alive just to spite people," Silas panted, leaning against the wall. "And besides, if you kick the bucket, my head explodes. Mutual survival, remember?" Vespera tilted her head, a gesture that was almost human. "No, your heart rate increased by 40% when the weapon was pointed at me. That was not a calculated survival response. That was something else." Silas looked away, checking his remaining ammo. "It's called adrenaline, Vespera. Or maybe I'm just a moron. Now can we move? More of those tin cans are going to be here in 3 minutes." She deactivated her blade, the distorted air snapping back into place. "Follow me. There is a maintenance lift 300 meters to the east. It leads to the docking ring." As they ran, the station groaned. Somewhere deep in its core, the gravity generators were failing. Silas felt his weight shift, his stomach turning as the artificial gravity fluctuated. Through the bridge, he felt a sudden spike of anxiety from Vespera. It wasn't hers, it was his being reflected back at her. "Focus, Thorn," he muttered, "one light year at a time." They weren't just escaping a prison. They were breaking a cycle that had lasted for centuries. The sovereignty had spent 1,000 years convincing the galaxy that some beings were born to be kings and others were born to be tools. But as Silas looked at the silver-haired woman leading him through the darkness, he realized the biggest lie of all. They had told him she was a monster, and they had told her he was nothing. They were both wrong. The memory hit Silas like a physical blow, triggered by the rhythmic humming of the maintenance lift. Suddenly, he wasn't in a dark corridor on the run. He was back in the grand hall of the thalassic sovereignty 3 months ago. The hall was an architectural nightmare designed to make a man feel insignificant. It was a dome of black obsidian, 500 meters high, with seats arranged in steep, vertigo-inducing tiers. Thousands of alien representatives sat in the shadows, their eyes like cold jewels watching the tiny human standing in the center of the floor. "Silas Thorn," a voice boomed, echoing from a dozen speakers at once. The High Overseer of the Reach sat on a throne of liquid light. He was a creature of shimmering scales and multiple limbs, his presence radiating an aura of absolute authority. "You have been found guilty of trespassing within the Nexus Nebula. and the unauthorized harvesting of Chronos crystals. Silas stood tall, despite the heavy gravity shackles pulling his shoulders down. He looked like a mess. His flight suit was torn, his beard was overgrown, and his face was bruised from the interrogation he'd received on the transport ship. "I was harvesting medicine," Silas said, his voice raspy but steady. "My colony on Velonis Prime is dying of the silver lung. Those crystals are the only things that can stabilize the atmosphere. Your people weren't using them. They were just sitting there in the dirt." "The law of the sovereignty is absolute," the overseer replied. "Theft from the imperial reach is punishable by death or permanent labor. However, your biology has caught the interest of our research division." Silas felt a chill go down his spine. Research division was a polite way of saying, the people who cut you open while you're still screaming. "We have a vacancy," the overseer continued, a hint of cruel amusement in his tone. "Our primary deterrent, the Xylari weapon, has once again reached a state of critical instability. She requires a new harmonic anchor." A murmur went through the crowd. Silas didn't know much about the Xylari, but he'd heard the stories. Every pilot in the sector knew the legend of the Queen of Silence, the woman who could collapse a star with a thought, and who drove every man she touched to madness. "You're talking about the bonding, aren't you?" Silas asked, his jaw tightening. "I've heard what happens to the guys you send in there. They don't come out. And if they do, they're babbling like infants." The overseer leaned forward. "The success rate is indeed 0%. But you are a pathfinder, Silas Thorne. Your psychological profile shows a high tolerance for isolation and a stubborn refusal to accept defeat. We offer you a choice: summary execution by vacuum decompression right now, or you become the partner to Weapon Prime." Silas looked around the room. He saw no mercy in the thousands of eyes watching him. He thought about the people back on Velonis Prime, the families waiting for a cure that would never come. He thought about his own life, 20 years of drifting, of losing people he loved, of searching for a purpose that always stayed just out of reach. "If I survive," he said, the words feeling like stones in his mouth, "do I get the crystals for my people?" The overseer paused. A flicker of surprise crossed his multifaceted eyes. "If you survive 1 year of companionship with the Xylari, your crimes will be pardoned, and your colony will receive a shipment of medical-grade Chronos crystals." Silas took a deep breath. He knew it was a lie. He knew they expected him to die. But a 1 in a million chance was still better than a 0% chance. "I accept," he said. The silence that followed was heavy. It was the sound of 1,000 beings holding their breath in disbelief. They had expected him to beg. They had expected him to scream. Instead, he had just made a deal with the devil. The memory faded as the maintenance lift jolted to a stop. Silas shook his head, the cold vibration of the bridge bringing him back to the present. He looked at Vespera. She was watching him, her cobalt eyes glowing with an intensity that suggested she had seen everything he was just remembering. "The bridge works both ways, Silas," she said softly. Her mental voice felt less like a ripple and more like a warm hum this time. "I felt your memory. I felt the weight of your promise to your people." Silas grunted, checking the lift doors. "Yeah, well, don't get used to it. My brain is a messy place, lady. You might trip over some bad memories if you go wandering too deep." "We are arriving at the docking ring," she said, ignoring his deflection. "There is a small scout ship, ID CX-14. It is fast, but it is heavily guarded." Silas gripped his pistol, his knuckles white. "Fast is all I care about. Once we're in the pilot's seat, I'll show you why they call me a pathfinder." The doors slid open, and the cold vacuum of the docking bay hit them. Beyond the atmospheric shields, the stars of the Nexus Nebula burned like scattered diamonds on black velvet. Hundreds of ships were docked in rows, but Silas's eyes immediately locked onto a sleek, needle-shaped vessel painted in matte black. "That's our ticket," he said, a grin finally touching his lips. But between them and the ship stood a squad of elite sovereignty dragoons. They weren't the standard enforcers. These were the killers, the ones who didn't miss. Their armor was jet black, and they carried long, glowing energy lances that hummed with enough power to melt a bulkhead. "No more games," a voice rang out over the bay's intercom. It was the High Overseer. "Kill the human. Bring the Zilari back to the stabilization chamber. If she resists, use the neural dampeners." Silas felt the bridge in his skull begin to burn. A wave of agonizing heat flooded his nervous system as the Sovereignty activated the remote dampeners, trying to force Vespera into submission through his body. He fell to one knee, a cry of pain escaping his throat. Vespera gasped, her silver hair suddenly whipping around her as if caught in a storm. The air around her began to crackle with blue static. She looked down at Silas, her eyes flickering between cobalt and a terrifying, lightless black. "They are using you to hurt me," she whispered, her voice echoing with the sound of 1,000 dying stars. Silas looked up, his vision blurring. He grabbed her hand, his fingers digging into her cool skin. "Then, let them," he snarled through clenched teeth. "I can take it. Don't let them put you back in that cage, Vespera." For the first time, Vespera's expression shattered. The cold mask of the weapon fell away, revealing a raw, human-like desperation. She looked at the dragoons, then back at Silas. "I will not let you die, Silas Thorne," she said. The energy around her didn't just crackle, it exploded. The gravity in the docking bay reversed in a sudden, violent pulse. The dragoons were lifted off their feet, their heavy armor useless as they floated helplessly in the air. Vespera stood in the center of the chaos, her hands glowing with the light of a miniature sun. Silas felt the pain in his head vanish, replaced by a strange, soaring sense of calm. The bridge was still there, but it wasn't a needle anymore. It was a wire, hummed by a beautiful, impossible song. He stood up, his body feeling lighter than it ever had. "Move!" he shouted over the roar of the collapsing gravity fields. They ran toward the scout ship, dodging the floating debris and the struggling soldiers. Silas leaped into the air, the low gravity carrying him toward the airlock. He punched in a series of override codes he'd been practicing in his head for weeks. The hatch hissed open. Vespera followed him, her feet touching the deck with a metallic clink. She looked back one last time at the Obsidian Spire, the place that had been her prison for 100 years. With a flick of her wrist, she sent a pulse of dark energy toward the docking clamps. The massive metal arms shattered like glass. The scout ship's engines roared to life, a brilliant blue flame erupting from the thrusters. Silas slammed his hands onto the controls, his fingers dancing across the holographic displays with the muscle memory of a man born to fly. "Strap in, Vespera," he yelled, his heart pounding with a mix of terror and pure, unadulterated joy. "We're about to pull a hard burn." The ship shot out of the docking bay, leaving the Obsidian Spire behind as a shrinking speck in the darkness. As they hit the edge of the nebula, Silas looked over at Vespera. She was sitting in the co-pilot's chair, staring out at the open space she hadn't seen in a century. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice quiet. Silas looked at the star map, then back at her. "Anywhere but here, Vespera. The galaxy is a big place. I think it's time we both found out what's actually in it." Behind them, the first warp trails of the Sovereignty fleet began to appear, 100 points of light chasing them into the void. The hunt had begun, but for the first time in his life, Silas Thorne didn't feel like prey. He felt like a man who had finally found something worth fighting for. And beside him, the Star Eater was no longer a weapon. She was a passenger on a journey that would change the fate of every living soul in the stars. The void was not empty. To a man like Silas Thorne, the space between stars was a crowded neighborhood of radiation, gravitational ghosts, and the persistent, low-frequency hum of 1,000 dying echoes. But inside the cockpit of the CX-14, the silence was different. It was heavy, pressurized by the presence of the woman sitting in the co-pilot's seat. The stolen scout ship, which Silas had unofficially dubbed the Dust Eater, vibrated with a frantic energy that had nothing to do with its engines. The neural harmonic bridge at the base of Silas's skull was no longer just a needle. It had become a glowing wire of white-hot intensity. He could feel Vespera's heartbeat, or the rhythmic pulse of energy that served as one, thrumming through his own ribcage. It was an invasive, terrifying intimacy. Every time she looked out the view screen at the retreating silhouette of the Obsidian Spire, Silas felt a wave of cold fury wash through his mind. It wasn't his anger. It was hers, a century of bottled lightning finally finding a ground. "Keep it together, Thorne," he whispered to himself, his fingers white-knuckled on the flight yoke. "If you blow a gasket now, we're both drifting salvage." They were pushing the engines to 110% of their rated capacity. The reactor core was screaming, a high-pitched whine that vibrated through the floor plates and into the soles of Silas's boots. According to the long-range scanners, a squadron of thalassic interceptors was already burning a trail through the nebula behind them. They were fast, sleek machines designed for one thing: the high-speed pursuit and termination of rogue elements. Vespera turned her head. Her cobalt eyes seemed to pierce through the metal of the ship, looking into the dark. "They are closing the gap," she said. Her voice in his head was a sharp contrast to the chaotic noise of the ship. It was calm, almost melodic, despite the destruction they had left behind. "They have activated their slipstream drives. They will be within weapons range in less than 10 minutes. Silas glanced at the tactical display. The 3 red icons were moving with a predatory grace, cutting through the gas clouds of the Nexus Nebula like sharks through bloody water. 10 minutes, he muttered. "That's barely enough time to check the oil." "Vespera, I need you to listen to me. I'm going to pull a stunt that might turn this ship into a very expensive cloud of confetti. I need you to hold the gravity dampeners steady. If the bridge fluctuates while we're in the turn, my brain is going to turn into oatmeal." The Xylari woman shifted in her seat, her silver hair shimmering in the dim cockpit light. "I have never been an anchor for a human pilot," she replied. "The scientists only used our connection to drain my excess potential. They did not intend for us to work in symmetry." "Well, the scientists aren't the ones with their backs against the wall right now," Silas snapped, his tone sharp with the edge of a man who had spent too many years surviving on luck and grit. "We're doing this my way. Just follow the rhythm of my thoughts. If you feel me start to panic, don't pull away. Just stay with me." Silas kicked the thrusters into a manual override. The ship groaned, the sound of protesting metal echoing through the small cabin. He wasn't heading for open space. He was heading for the Iron Graveyard, a massive field of shattered moons and derelict mining stations that drifted on the edge of the nebula. It was a death trap for anyone without a Pathfinder's instincts, a maze of jagged obsidian and forgotten shadows. As they approached the first of the shattered moons, the ship began to buffet. The gravitational anomalies of the graveyard were notorious for stripping the hulls off of even the most advanced sovereignty cruisers. Silas felt the sweat stinging his eyes, his breath coming in short, jagged bursts. He was terrified. Every instinct he possessed told him to turn back, to find a clearer path, to surrender to the cold logic of survival. But he didn't. "Why do you continue?" Vespera's voice was a soft ripple in the back of his mind. "You are afraid. Your adrenaline is at critical levels. Your heart is laboring to keep pace with your fear. Why do you not simply choose the path of least resistance?" "Because the path of least resistance leads back to a cage," Silas gritted out, his teeth clenched against the G-force as he swung the ship into a narrow crevice between two drifting moon fragments. "And I'm done with cages, Vespera. Being afraid is just part of the job description for a human. It's what you do while you're shaking that matters." He slammed the ship into a vertical roll, the stars outside the view screen spinning into a dizzying blur. The interceptors behind them struggled to follow, their automated flight systems chirping in protest at the erratic maneuvers. One of the pursuers clipped an Obsidian Spire, its wing shearing off in a shower of sparks before it vanished into the darkness. "Two left," Silas panted. Through the bridge, he felt a sudden, sharp spike of something unfamiliar. It wasn't anger or exhaustion. It was a flicker of admiration. Vespera was watching his hands, watching the way he anticipated the movement of the debris before it even appeared on the scanners. She began to hum, a low, resonant sound that vibrated through the neural link. The pain in Silas's head didn't disappear, but it changed. It became a steady weight, a foundation. The chaotic energy of the Xylari was no longer attacking his nervous system, it was reinforcing it. He felt his reaction times sharpen. The world seemed to slow down, the tumbling rocks of the graveyard moving with a predictable, almost sluggish grace. "We are in sync, Thorn," Vespera whispered. "Let's show these squids how a human flies," Silas said, a manic grin spreading across his face. He dived deeper into the graveyard, heading for the heart of a dead mining station. The structure was a labyrinth of rusted girders and hollowed-out docking bays. Silas didn't slow down. He pushed the throttle forward, the ship's engines burning a brilliant, defiant white. He threaded the needle through a collapsing hangar, the wingtips of the Dust Eater missing the jagged metal by less than 2 meters. The remaining interceptors followed, their pilots fueled by the cold discipline of the sovereignty. But they lacked the one thing Silas had in abundance: the willingness to be foolishly, dangerously brave. As the lead interceptor tried to follow Silas through a series of rapid-fire turns, its pilot hesitated for a fraction of a second. That was all it took. The ship smashed into a massive crane arm, exploding in a brilliant orange fireball that illuminated the entire graveyard. The last pursuer pulled back, its sensors unable to track the small scout ship through the interference of the debris and the explosion. Silas kept the ship moving for another 20 minutes, winding through the shadows until the scanners showed nothing but the empty, humming dark of the graveyard. Only then did he allow the engines to drop back to a cruising speed. He slumped in his seat, his hands trembling so violently he had to tuck them under his arms. His breath was a series of ragged wheezes. The silence of the cockpit returned, but it was no longer heavy. It felt earned. "You are still alive," Vespera said, her voice filled with a genuine sense of wonder. "Barely," Silas wheezed. "I think I left my soul back there in that hangar." "You were afraid the entire time," she noted, her cobalt eyes fixed on him. "Yet you did not deviate from the most dangerous course. You did not let the fear dictate the movement of your hands." "I told you," Silas said, closing his eyes for a moment. "Courage isn't about being some big, fearless hero. It's about being scared to death, and then doing the right thing anyway. If I'd played it safe, we'd be scrap metal right now. Vespera remained silent for a long time, her gaze turning back to the stars. The thalassic sovereignty does not teach this, she said softly. They teach that fear is a failure of the system, a bug to be purged. They believe that only the cold and the calculated can survive the great ocean of stars. Then they're missing out on the best part of being alive, Silas replied. He leaned forward and began tapping at the navigational computer. We can't stay here long. The Iron Graveyard is a good hiding spot, but the Sovereignty will send a sweep team eventually. We need to find a place to ground the ship and fix the cooling units. We're leaking ionized gas like a punctured lung. I know of a place, Vespera said, an outpost on the edge of the Vale of Sorrows. It was abandoned during the Great Expansion. It is not on any modern imperial charts. The Vale of Sorrows? Silas raised an eyebrow. Sounds like a real vacation spot. Why is it called that? Because it is where the stars go to die, she replied. Perfect, Silas muttered, bank-turning the ship toward the new coordinates. My kind of neighborhood. As the ship slipped into warp, the blue light of the jump tunnel illuminating the cockpit, Silas felt the bridge at the base of his skull settle into a gentle, rhythmic hum. For the first time since he had been captured, the presence in his mind didn't feel like a punishment. It felt like a partner, and as he drifted into a shallow, exhausted sleep while the autopilot took over, he realized that the most dangerous woman in the galaxy was no longer the thing he feared the most. The thing he feared was what would happen if he ever had to let her go. The outpost was a skeleton of titanium and glass clinging to the side of a jagged, airless moon. It was called Nexara Prime, though the name had been scrubbed from every official record 300 years ago. As the Dust Eater touched down on the cracked landing pad, the ship's landing struts groaned under the weight of the uneven terrain. Silas sat in the pilot's seat for a full minute after the engines died, listening to the cooling metal tinks and pops. The bridge in his head had dimmed to a dull ache, a constant reminder of the woman sitting beside him. He unbuckled his harness, his muscles screaming in protest. "We need to be quick," Silas said, standing up and stretching his stiff back. "The atmosphere in this place is thinner than a politician's promise. We've got about 4 hours of breathable air in the ship's tanks, and I don't trust the outpost's life support to do anything but leak." Vespera stood as well, her movements fluid and silent. She didn't seem affected by the G-force or the exhaustion that was currently threatening to topple Silas over. She walked to the small equipment locker and pulled out a portable power cell. "I will assist with the repairs," she said. Silas looked at her, a skeptical expression on his face. "No offense, Vespera, but you're more of a destroy things with your mind kind of girl. I don't know if you're built for turning wrenches and recalibrating plasma conduits." "I am a fast learner, Silas Thorne," she replied, her eyes flashing with a hint of something that might have been amusement. "And I can see the energy flow within the machines. I can tell you exactly where the fractures are before you even open the casing," Silas grunted. "Fine. Just don't accidentally vaporize the ship while you're looking at it." They stepped out into the airless silence of the moon. Silas was encased in a battered, scuffed EVA suit that had seen better days, while Vespera simply shimmered, a faint field of energy surrounding her body like a second skin. It was a stark reminder of the gap between them, the fragile human and the celestial weapon. Inside the outpost's main hangar, the air was cold and smelled of ancient dust and forgotten dreams. Silas set to work on the ship's cooling array, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. He'd spent his whole life fixing things that were broken, from freighter engines to the shattered hopes of his colony. It was the only thing that kept the noise in his head from getting too loud. As he worked, Vespera stood nearby, her hand resting on the side of the ship. She wasn't just watching. She was listening. Silas could feel her through the bridge, her consciousness dipping into the mechanical rhythms of the vessel. "There is a microfracture in the primary injector," she said, her voice echoing in his mind, 3 centimeters from the fuel intake. "It will fail if you attempt another high-speed burn." Silas cursed under his breath and adjusted his scanner. Sure enough, a tiny, jagged line appeared on the display. "Good catch," he muttered. "I would have missed that until it was too late." He pulled out a welding torch and began to seal the crack. For a long time, the only sound was the hiss of the torch and the rhythmic clanging of Silas's tools. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was a shared space of focus and survival. "Why did you really come to the Nexus Nebula?" Vespera asked suddenly. Her question caught him off guard, the torch slipping slightly and scorching the metal. "I told the Overseer," Silas said, his voice muffled by his helmet. "My colony was dying. I needed the crystals." Vespera moved closer, her energy field casting a soft blue glow over his workspace. "You told him the truth, but not the whole truth. I can feel the resonance of your grief, Silas. It is an old wound, one that has never properly closed. It is the reason you were able to survive the bonding." Silas stopped working. He turned to look at her, his face hidden behind the tinted visor of his helmet. "What are you talking about?" "The thalassic scientists were fools," Vespera said, her voice tinged with a cold disdain. "They believed that to survive the link with a Zelari, a host had to be perfect. They chose warriors with hearts of stone and minds like steel. They chose beings who had never known failure or loss, and because of that, they were brittle. When my energy touched them, they shattered like glass under a hammer." She reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from his visor. "But you are already broken, Silas Thorne. Your mind is full of fractures and scars. When my energy enters you, it doesn't break you. It fills the gaps. It flows through the cracks of your old sorrows like water through a dry riverbed. Your pain is what makes you stable." Silas felt a lump form in his throat. He looked down at the welding torch in his hand. "My pain isn't a feature, Vespera. It's a burden. I failed my family. 12 years ago, back on Earth 2, I was a foreman at one of the deep core mines. I saw the signs of a cave-in coming. I told my supervisors, but they didn't want to lose a day's worth of quotas. They told me to keep the crews working." He swallowed hard, the memory vivid and painful. "I didn't push back. I was scared of losing my job, scared of being the guy who caused trouble. So I sent them in. My brother was on that shift, my wife's youngest sister. 22 people never came back out of that hole." Vespera stayed silent, letting the weight of the story settle in the cold air of the hangar. "I spent the next decade trying to make up for it," Silas continued, his voice barely a whisper. "I became a pathfinder because I wanted to be the one who found the way out, the one who didn't hesitate when things got ugly. But it doesn't matter how many people I save or how many crystals I find. That fear, that moment where I didn't speak up, it stays with you. It's a shadow that never leaves. You believe you are weak because you were afraid," Vespera said. "But you are wrong. The fact that you carry that weight every day and still choose to move forward is the greatest strength I have ever witnessed. The sovereignty soldiers I killed today, they have no fear because they have no choice. They are hollow. You are full of the storm, Silas. And that is why I chose to stay with you." Silas looked up at her, surprised. "You chose to stay?" I thought the bridge forced you. The bridge is a conduit, she replied, but the connection requires a point of resonance. In the grand hall, when the overseer sentenced you, I looked into your eyes, and I saw a man who was already walking through fire. I realized that if I was ever going to find my own way back to being something more than a weapon, I needed an anchor who understood the dark. For a long moment, they just stood there in the quiet of the derelict outpost. The human pilot and the alien warrior, two broken things finding a way to fit together. Suddenly, the ship's proximity alarm blared, a harsh, discordant sound that shattered the moment. Silas jumped to his feet, his hand instinctively going to his pistol. "Talk to me, Dust Eater! What have we got?" A holographic display flickered to life on the side of the ship. A single icon appeared, a jagged black shape that looked like a shard of obsidian carved into a spear. "A shadow wraith," Vespera said, her voice turning cold and sharp. "The Sovereignty's specialized hunting drones. They are faster than the interceptors and equipped with phased weaponry. It must have tracked our ionized trail through the graveyard." "How far out?" Silas asked, scrambling toward the ship's airlock. 50 kilometers and closing," Vespera replied, already moving toward the cockpit. "It will be on us in less than 2 minutes." Silas slammed the hatch shut and jumped into the pilot's seat. "We can't fight that thing on the ground. It'll just pick us apart from the atmosphere. We have to get into the air." He punched the ignition. The engines roared to life, but they sounded ragged, the cooling units still struggling to stabilize. The ship lifted off the landing pad, the struts kicking up a cloud of ancient dust as they shot toward the black sky. As they breached the moon's thin atmosphere, the shadow wraith appeared on the view screen. It was a terrifying piece of engineering, its hull seemingly made of shifting smoke and shadow. It didn't fire conventional weapons. Instead, a beam of purple phased light erupted from its prow, striking the Dust Eater's shields with a violent impact. The ship buckled. Alarms screamed in every corner of the cockpit. "Shield integrity at 40%, Silas shouted. "One more hit like that, and we're toast." Vespera closed her eyes. Her hands gripped the arms of her chair, her knuckles turning bone-white. "I cannot strike it, Silas. Its hull is phased. My energy pulses will pass right through it unless we can force it to materialize." "How do we do that?" Silas asked, fighting the yoke as the wraith dived for another pass. "We have to create a gravitational anchor," she said, her voice strained. "I need to focus my power into a single point, but I cannot do it while the ship is moving this erratically. I need a steady platform for at least 5 seconds." 5 seconds? Silas looked at the wraith as it looped around for another strike. 5 seconds is an eternity when you're being hunted by a ghost. "I will hold the shields," Vespera said, "but you must hold the ship. Can you do it, Silas? Can you stand in the fire one more time?" Silas looked at the purple light gathering at the prow of the enemy drone. He felt the fear cold and sharp in his gut, the same fear that had frozen him 12 years ago in the mines. But this time, he didn't look away. He didn't hesitate. "Hold on tight," he said, his voice dropping to a low, determined growl. He leveled the ship, cutting the thrusters and letting the Dust Eater drift in a straight, predictable line. He was a sitting duck, a perfect target for the most advanced hunter in the galaxy. The shadow wraith fired. The purple beam struck the ship's nose, but this time, the energy didn't just hit the shields. It hit the wall of power that Vespera had projected around the hull. The ship shook violently, the metal groaning as it absorbed the massive impact. Silas felt the bridge at the base of his skull ignite, the heat so intense he thought his brain was literally on fire. He screamed, his hands locked on the controls, his teeth drawing blood from his lip as he refused to move. 1 second. 2 seconds. The bridge hummed with a sound like 1,000 screaming sirens. Silas could feel Vespera's energy surging through him, using his physical body as a lens. It was agonizing, every nerve ending in his body screaming for him to let go, to run, to hide. 3 seconds. 4 seconds. The shadow wraith moved closer, its phased hull shimmering as it prepared to deliver the killing blow. It was so close, Silas could see the individual sensor arrays on its prow. 5 seconds! Vespera shouted. She threw her hands forward. A wave of lightless energy erupted from the ship, a localized singularity that caught the shadow wraith in its grip. The drone's phased hull suddenly snapped into solid reality as the gravity well crushed its internal generators. Silas didn't wait. He slammed the thrusters forward, the ship's nose dipping as he dove underneath the struggling drone. Now, Vespera! Finish it! Vespera let out a sharp cry, and the singularity collapsed. The shadow wraith was turned inside out, its obsidian hull imploding into a tiny point of light before vanishing in a silent, violent flash. The shockwave hit the Dust Eater, sending it spinning into the darkness. Silas fought the controls, his vision swimming with black spots, until he finally managed to stabilize the ship. The silence returned, deeper and more profound than before. Silas slumped back in his seat, his suit soaked in sweat, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He looked over at Vespera. She was leaning back in her chair, her eyes closed, her energy field dimmed to a faint, exhausted glimmer. "We did it," she whispered, her voice barely audible in his head. "Yeah," Silas wheezed, wiping the blood from his mouth. "We did it. But don't ever ask me to do that again. My brain feels like it's been through a blender." "You stood still," Vespera said, opening her eyes and looking at him with a gaze that was no longer cold. "You faced the end, and you did not blink." "I was blinking plenty," Silas muttered, a ghost of a smile appearing on his face. "I just did it while I was holding the throttle." As the ship drifted away from the moon of Nexara Prime, heading back into the safety of the warp, Silas felt the bridge settle into a new kind of rhythm. It wasn't just a link anymore, it was a conversation. And as he looked at the star map, searching for their next destination, he realized that for the first time in 12 years, the shadow of the mines felt a little less heavy. He hadn't stopped being afraid. He had just learned how to use the fear as fuel. And in the dangerous ocean of stars, that was more powerful than any weapon the Sovereignty had ever built. The galaxy was still full of monsters and kings, but as the Dust Eater vanished into the blue light of the jump, Silas Thorne knew one thing for certain. They were going to have to do a lot better than a shadow wraith if they wanted to put the Queen of Silence back in her cage. Because she wasn't alone anymore. She had an anchor. And the anchor was just getting started. The jump tunnel collapsed into a pinprick of light, and the Dust Eater slammed back into real space with a violent shudder that threatened to rattle Silas's teeth out of his skull. Outside the view screen, the chaotic neon purples of the Nexus Nebula had been replaced by the cold, stagnant gray of the outer rim. They were hovering on the edge of the Veil of Sorrows, a graveyard of stars where the light felt thin, as if the universe were running out of ink. Ahead of them drifted Mariner's Rest. It wasn't a station so much as a collection of dead freighters and hollowed-out asteroids lashed together with massive carbon fiber cables and prayer. It was the kind of place where the law was something people joked about over glasses of recycled synthale, and where a man's past mattered much less than the contents of his cargo hold. "Keep the profile low," Silas muttered, his voice sounding hollow in the cramped cockpit. "We don't want every scrap vulture in 3 sectors knowing we've arrived." Vespera remained motionless in the co-pilot's seat, her cobalt eyes fixed on the floating shantytown. Through the bridge at the base of his brain, Silas felt her curiosity. It was a soft, inquisitive hum, a sharp contrast to the jagged edges of his own anxiety. To her, this place was a testament to the chaotic persistence of life. To him, it was a reminder of everything he had spent 20 years trying to outrun. "This is a sanctuary for those who have been discarded," she said, her mental voice carrying a note of quiet observation. "It reminds me of the Valari outposts before the sovereignty came with their banners and their cages." "Yeah, well, don't get too sentimental, Vespera," Silas replied, his fingers dancing across the communications array. "This place is a shark tank. You show a drop of blood, and the whole station starts biting." He opened a private channel, one he hadn't used in 5 long years. He used a series of encrypted handshakes, codes buried deep within the firmware of the ship's old navigation computer. "Oasis Control. This is Pathfinder 7-9. I'm looking for a harbor and a stiff drink. Requesting docking bay 4B. Password is, the wind doesn't blow in the void." There was a long, agonizing silence. Silas felt the sweat cooling on the back of his neck. If the contact had moved on, or worse, if they had been scrubbed by the sovereignty, he was essentially ringing a bell for his own funeral. Finally, the speaker crackled with a burst of static-heavy audio. "Pathfinder 7-9, you're a ghost. We heard you took a long walk off a short pier back in the Reach. Bay 4B is open, but keep your scanners dark. We've got hi-hats prowling the neighborhood." The voice belonged to Jax, a man who had more cybernetic parts than organic ones, and a moral compass that pointed whichever way the credits were flowing. Silas blew out a breath he didn't know he was holding. "Copy that, Oasis. Coming in hot." He guided the scout ship toward the docking ring, the Dust Eater's thrusters firing in short, controlled bursts. The hangar doors groaned open like the jaws of a rusted beast, and the ship slipped inside, the artificial atmosphere hissing as it pressurized the bay. As the engines died, Silas slumped back in his seat. "We have to be smart about this, Vespera. You can't go out there looking like a celestial queen. Put on the cloak I found in the equipment locker. Keep the hood low. If anyone asks, you're a silent sister from the Obsidian sect. People tend to leave them alone out of superstitious fear." "I am already a figure of fear, Silas," she said, standing up. "Does it matter which mask I wear?" "It matters because fear leads to questions, and questions lead to thalassic cruisers," Silas snapped, more harshly than he intended. He felt a wave of guilt through the bridge and softened his tone. "Look, I'm just trying to keep us breathing. This place is full of void-drunk, desperate types. One look at you, and they'll be calling in a tip to the sovereignty for a bounty that would buy them their own planet." "I understand," she whispered. "I will be your shadow." They stepped out of the ship and onto the oil-stained deck of the hangar. The air was thick with the smell of burnt ozone, rotting protein, and the metallic tang of old machinery. It was the smell of the fringe, and for a moment, Silas felt a wave of homesickness so sharp it made his chest ache. It reminded him of the mining colonies, of the people he had left behind. A figure emerged from the shadows near the control booth. Jax hadn't changed much in 5 years, except for a new glowing red optical sensor that sat where his left eye used to be. He was wearing a grease-stained flight jacket and carrying a heavy-duty plasma torch as if it were a walking stick. "Silas Thorne," Jax said, a jagged grin revealing teeth made of polished chrome. "You look like you've been dragged through a black hole and spat out the other side." "Good to see you too, Jax," Silas said, stepping forward to shake the man's hand. The contact was brief, but Silas felt the hidden sensors in Jax's palms scanning his suit, checking for tracking bugs or unauthorized tech. "Who's the quiet one?" Jax asked, his red eye whirring as it tried to focus on the hooded figure behind Silas. "She's got a weird energy signature, Silas. My scanners are jumping like a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs. She's a passenger, Silas said, his voice dropping an octave. A silent sister. We're just passing through, Jax. I need a full diagnostic on the ship. 500 gallons of refined deuterium, and whatever Chronos crystals you've got in the back room. Jax whistled, a low, sharp sound. Chronos crystals? You're aiming high, brother. Those things are worth 100,000 credits a gram these days. The Sovereignty has a total lock on the supply. I know what they're worth, Silas said, and I know you've got a stash from that freighter heist 2 months ago. Don't lie to me, Jax. I still have friends in the Pathfinder network. Jax laughed, a dry, raspy sound. Fine, fine. You always were a nosy scout. But it's going to cost you, and not just credits. I need a favor. Silas felt Vespera tense behind him. Through the bridge, he felt her suspicion flare like a solar flare. Careful, Silas, she projected into his mind. He is hiding a secret beneath his skin. His pulse is irregular. Not now, Silas thought back at her, trying to keep his mental wall steady. He led Jax toward the back of the hangar, away from the prying eyes of the security cameras. What kind of favor? There's a group on the station, Jax whispered, leaning in close. They call themselves the Echoes, survivors of the outer colonies, mostly. People who lost everything when the Sovereignty decided their planets were strategically redundant. They heard rumors about a human who escaped the Obsidian Spire. They heard he wasn't alone. Silas felt the blood drain from his face. The rumors are moving faster than we are. People are looking for a sign, Silas, Jax said, his red eye glowing brighter. They're tired of living in the dirt. If the rumors are true, if you've actually got a Valari warrior with you, it would change everything. It would mean the Sovereignty isn't invincible. Silas shook his head, his hands clenching into fists. I'm not a revolutionary, Jax. I'm a pilot. I'm just trying to get some medicine for my people and disappear. I don't want to be anyone's sign. It's too late for that, Vespera said aloud. She pulled back her hood, her silver hair spilling out like a waterfall of liquid light. Jax froze, his plasma torch clattering to the floor. His mechanical eye whirred frantically, unable to process the sheer intensity of her presence. She wasn't just a woman. She was a focal point of power, a celestial entity standing in the middle of a grease-stained hangar. The Queen of Silence, Jax breathed, his voice trembling. The stories didn't do you justice. She ignored him, looking directly at Silas. You speak of courage being the act of moving forward despite fear, Silas Thorne. But you are using your fear as a shield. You think that by staying small, you can protect your world. But the Sovereignty has already marked you. You cannot run from a storm you are already carrying inside you. Silas looked from Vespera to Jax, feeling the walls of his carefully constructed survival plan closing in. This was the turning point he had dreaded. He could take the supplies and run, continuing his life as a fugitive. Or he could step into the light and become the catalyst for something he couldn't control. I just wanted to save my colony, Silas whispered, his voice cracking. I didn't ask to lead an army. None of us ask for the weight we carry, Silas, Jax said, recovering his composure but still looking at Vespera with a mixture of awe and terror. But the Echoes are waiting. They have information you need. The Sovereignty isn't just looking for you because you escaped. They're looking for you because of the bridge. The bridge? Silas touched the back of his neck, the metal implant feeling colder than usual. They figured out what you're doing, Silas, Jax said. They realized you aren't just a stabilizer. You're a filter. You're the only thing that can make a Valeri's power precise enough to use for surgical strikes instead of just mass destruction. They don't want to kill you anymore. They want to harvest you. Silas felt a wave of nausea. He looked at Vespera, and through the bridge, he felt her horror mirroring his own. They weren't just partners in survival. They were a prototype for a new kind of weapon. "Come with me," Jax said, gesturing toward a hidden door in the back of the hangar. "Talk to the echoes. See what they have to say. Then decide if you're still just a pilot." As they walked through the narrow, twisting tunnels of Mariner's Rest, Silas felt the fear returning, sharper than ever. But this time, it wasn't just fear for himself. It was a terrifying realization of the cost of staying silent. If he didn't learn to stand his ground now, the entire galaxy was going to pay the price for his hesitation. The meeting room of the Echoes was a hollowed-out cargo container buried deep within the station's structural supports. It was cramped, dimly lit by flickering neon tubes, and smelled of desperation and unwashed bodies. There were 20 people inside, men, women, and aliens from a dozen different systems, all of them wearing the same expression of hollowed-out grief. When Silas and Vespera entered, the room went deathly silent. It wasn't the silence of respect. It was the silence of a congregation seeing a miracle they weren't sure they wanted to believe in. "This is them," Jax announced, his voice echoing in the small space. "The Pathfinder and the Star Eater." A woman stood up from the back. She was old, her skin like wrinkled parchment, and her left arm had been replaced by a crude industrial-grade prosthetic. She looked at Silas with eyes that had seen too many worlds burn. "My name is Alara," she said. "I was a doctor on the Krios colonies. Before the Sovereignty relocated us. We've been tracking your flight path since you left the Iron Graveyard." Silas crossed his arms, his posture defensive. "Tracking us? I thought we were being careful." "You were," Alara said, "but the Sovereignty is broadcasting a high-frequency search signal on the same wavelength as your neural bridge. To them, you're a beacon in the dark. Every time your heart rate spikes, the signal gets stronger." Silas looked at Vespera. "Is that true?" "I felt a resonance," she admitted, her voice low. "I thought it was just the interference of the nebula. I did not realize they were using our connection against us." "They aren't just looking for you," Ilara continued, stepping forward into the light. "They are preparing a new weapon. They call it Project Chimera. They've captured 30 more Valari warriors. They're trying to replicate your bridge, Silas. But they need the resonance data from a successful bond to make it work. You're the missing piece of the puzzle." Silas felt the weight of the revelation pressing down on his chest. 30 more? They want to turn your people into a fleet of controlled monsters? Vespera's eyes glowed with a sudden, violent intensity. Her energy field flared, the air in the room beginning to hum with static. The echoes recoiled, their faces pale with terror. "They will not," she hissed. "I will burn their empire to ash before I let them do this." "Easy, Vespera," Silas shouted, grabbing her arm. Through the bridge, he threw every ounce of his own calm, his own stubborn will, at her. He felt her power bucking against him like a wild animal, a storm of pure, unadulterated rage. "Vespera, look at me," he commanded. She turned to him, her face a mask of celestial fury. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw the fear there. Not the fear of her, but the fear of what she was becoming. She saw the memory of the mines, the memory of the people Silas had failed because he didn't know how to control the situation. Slowly, the static in the air died down. The glow in her eyes faded back to a steady cobalt. She took a shuddering breath, her shoulders sagging. "I am sorry," she whispered. "The thought of my sisters in those cages, it is more than I can bear." "We all have things we can't bear," Silas said, his voice softer now. "That's why we're here." Ilara watched them, a small, knowing smile touching her lips. "You see? The bridge isn't just a conduit for power. It's a conduit for humanity. That's what the sovereignty doesn't understand. They think they can control the Zilari with logic and pain, but you're controlling her with empathy, Silas. That's the real threat to them." Jax stepped forward, his red eye whirring. "We have a plan to stop them, Silas. We know where the Chimera facility is. It's a cloaked moon in the sector of silence. But we can't get past their shields without someone who knows the thalassic flight codes. Someone like a pathfinder." "No," Silas said, backing away. "No, I'm not doing it. I'm not a soldier. I just need my crystals and a way home." "Silas, your home is already gone," Jax shouted, his chrome teeth flashing. "The Sovereignty sent a suppression fleet to Velonis Prime 3 days ago. They heard about your theft. They're using your colony as leverage to bring you in." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Silas grabbed Jax by the collar, slamming him against the metal wall. "What did you say?" "They've got the colony under a blockade, Silas," Jax gasped, his mechanical eyes spinning wildly. "No one goes in, no one goes out. They're letting the Silver Lung do their work for them. If you don't turn yourself in within 72 hours, they're going to orbital strike the primary settlement." Silas let go of Jax, his hands shaking so much he had to hide them in his pockets. 72 hours. 3 days. Everything he had worked for, every sacrifice he had made, was being dismantled by the very people he had tried to outsmart. He felt the fear rising again, a cold, suffocating wave that threatened to drown him. He wanted to run. He wanted to take the ship and fly until he hit the edge of the universe. But then he felt Vespera. Through the bridge, he didn't feel her anger or her power. He felt her loyalty. He felt the way she was standing behind him, a steady, unbreakable anchor in the storm of his own doubt. She moved closer, her hand resting on his shoulder. "Silas," she said aloud, "you told me that courage is acting despite the fear. You told me that being a human means doing the right thing when it's the hardest thing to do." Silas looked at her, his eyes stinging. "I'm just one man, Vespera. I can't save a colony and a race of celestial warriors at the same time." "You are not one man," she said. "You are the partner of a star-eater, and I am the partner of a pathfinder. Together, we are something the Sovereignty has never seen." Silas looked around the room at the echoes. He saw the hope in their eyes, a fragile, desperate thing that he had ignited without even trying. He realized that Jax was right. He couldn't stay small anymore. The moment he accepted the bridge, his life as a simple pilot was over. "Fine," Silas said, his voice coming out as a low, dangerous growl. "We do it, but we do it my way. No suicide charges. We go in quiet, we hit them hard, and we get the hell out." Ilara nodded. "We've been preparing for months, Silas. We just needed a pilot." The meeting broke up into a flurry of activity as the echoes began to gather their gear and prepare the transport ships. Silas and Vespera walked back toward Docking Bay 4B, the silence between them filled with the weight of the decision they had just made. As they reached the hangar, Silas stopped. He looked at the Dust Eater, the ship that had been his only home for the last few years. "Vespera?" he said quietly. "Yes, Silas? If we don't make it, if this all goes sideways, I want you to know something." "I know, Silas," she said, her mental voice warm and steady. "I know. You are not the man who failed the mines anymore. You are the man who is choosing to stand. And that is enough." They were interrupted by a sudden, violent explosion that rocked the entire station. The alarms of Mariner's Rest began to scream, a high-pitched wail that signaled a hull breach in the outer ring. "They're here," Silas hissed, drawing his pistol. The sovereignty didn't wait for 72 hours. A squad of thalassic specters drifted into the hangar, their forms shimmering in and out of reality. These weren't the enforcers or the dragoons they had faced before. These were the elite, the silent killers of the Reach, equipped with phased stealth technology and neural scramblers that could fry a human brain from 50 meters away. Silas felt a sharp, stabbing pain in his head as the specters activated their scramblers. He fell to his knees, his vision blurring, his stomach churning with nausea. "Vespera!" he cried out, but he could feel her struggling too. The specters were focusing their mental attacks on the bridge, trying to sever the link between them. A tall, slender figure emerged from the center of the specter squad. He wore armor made of white bone glass and carried a staff that hummed with a sickly green light. It was High Inquisitor Malachor, the man responsible for the re-education of the Valari. "Pathfinder Thorn," Malachor said, his voice a series of clicking, musical tones. "You have been a very difficult subject to track, but your resonance is quite unmistakable. You are a natural filter, Silas, a beautiful, tragic fluke of biology." "Leave him alone," Vespera shouted, her energy field trying to push back the mental pressure. But she was weakened by the constant bombardment of the scramblers. Malachor chuckled. "Oh, we don't want to hurt him, my dear. We want to study him. We want to see how much of his humanity we can strip away before the bridge collapses. It should be a fascinating experiment." He raised his staff, the green light intensifying. The specters moved forward, their phased blades glowing with a deadly hunger. Silas looked up, his face pale and covered in sweat. He felt the fear, more powerful than it had ever been. But beneath the fear, he felt something else. He felt a spark of pure, stubborn defiance. He thought about his brother in the mines. He thought about the children on Velonis Prime. He thought about Vespera, the woman who had trusted him to be her anchor. He reached out and grabbed Vespera's hand. "Not today, you bony bastard," Silas spat, blood trickling from his nose. He didn't try to fight the mental pressure. He didn't try to hide behind his walls. Instead, he opened his mind completely. He let all of his fear, all of his grief, and all of his stubborn human love flow through the bridge and into Vespera. He didn't filter it. He used it as a signal. The reaction was instantaneous. Vespera's energy field didn't just flare, it turned into a supernova of white light. The specters were thrown backward, their phased armor shattering under the weight of the emotional surge. Malachor's staff cracked, the green light vanishing into the darkness. The entire hangar shook as the energy wave expanded, blowing out the lights and sending the station's artificial gravity into a tailspin. In the center of the storm, Silas and Vespera stood together, their hands locked, their minds unified in a way the sovereignty had never thought possible. They didn't just have a connection. They had a resonance. "We're leaving," Silas whispered, his voice echoing with the power of the Zilari. "Now." They scrambled into the Dust Eater as the hangar doors were shredded by the energy storm. As the ship roared out of Mariner's Rest and into the cold embrace of the void, Silas looked back at the station. The turning point had passed. The cost of silence had been revealed, and the price of loyalty had been set. They were no longer running. They were hunting. And as they punched the jump drive, heading toward the sector of silence, Silas Thorne knew that the galaxy was about to learn a very important lesson. You can cage a weapon, and you can cage a man. But you can never, ever cage the heart of a human who has finally decided to be brave. The journey to the heart of the sovereignty had begun, and this time they were bringing the storm with them. The sector of silence was not actually silent. It was a place where the static of the universe became so thick it sounded like the breath of a dying god. It was a graveyard of dead signals and ghost frequencies, a region of space where the laws of physics felt like they were written in disappearing ink. For a pilot like Silas Thorne, it was the ultimate test of instinct. There were no nav buoys here, no trade route beacons, and certainly no safety nets. There was only the hum of the Dust Eater's reactor and the cold, steady weight of the Xylari woman sitting in the co-pilot's seat. Silas adjusted the thruster calibration for the 10th time in an hour. His hands were slick with sweat inside his flight gloves. Through the neural harmonic bridge at the base of his skull, he could feel Vespera's focus. It was a sharp, crystalline thing that cut through the mental fog of the sector. She wasn't just sitting there, she was reaching out, her consciousness acting as a long-range sonar that bypassed the thalassic jamming fields. "They are close, Silas," she whispered in his mind. "The resonance is growing. It feels like a choir of voices screaming behind a wall of ice." Silas glanced at the tactical display. It was a mess of flickering shadows and false positives. "How many?" 32, Vespera replied, her voice trembling slightly. 32 of my sisters. They are being kept in a state of suspended agony. The sovereignty is harvesting their neural outputs to calibrate the chimera drives. It is a desecration." Silas reached out and placed a hand on her arm. He felt the static charge of her energy field crackle against his flight suit. "We're going to get them out, Vespera. I didn't come this far just to watch a horror show." Behind them, in the small cargo hold of the scout ship, Jax and Ilara were checking their gear. The Echoes were a small force, only 12 soldiers in 2 stolen transports, but they were the most desperate and determined group Silas had ever known. They were the people the sovereignty had tried to erase, and they were here to write their names back into the stars. Silas keyed the internal comms. "Jax, talk to me. Are the scramblers ready?" "Ready as they'll ever be, Silas." Jax's raspy voice came through the headset. "We've got 3 repurposed mining charges and enough electronic countermeasure grit to choke a shadow wraith. But remember, once we pop the cork on this bottle, every squid in the sector is going to be on our 6. We won't have more than 15 minutes before the heavy hitters show up." 15 minutes, Silas muttered. "That's a lifetime when you're bleeding." "Ilara, what's the word on the life support?" "The moon is a pressurized tomb, Silas," Ilara replied. "If we breach the main labs, the atmospheric stabilizers are going to go haywire. Everyone needs to stay sealed in their suits. And Silas, be careful with the bridge. If the feedback gets too high, you won't be able to fly us out of there." "I've got it under control," Silas said, though he knew it was a lie. The bridge was already starting to burn. It felt like a hot coal was being pressed into his spine, the heat radiating out through his nerves. He was the filter, the anchor, the thing that kept Vespera from turning into a mindless supernova of grief. But he was only human, and the strain was starting to show in the tremors of his fingers. The ghost moon of Morrows appeared on the view screen. It was a jagged, airless rock, completely encased in a shimmering field of phased cloaking. To the naked eye, it was invisible, but to the bridge, it stood out like a black sun. "That's it," Vespera said, her cobalt eyes glowing with a dark, vengeful light. "The heart of the machine." Silas took a deep breath, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He thought about the mines. He thought about the day he had stood silent while the crews walked into the dark. For 12 years, he had been haunted by the ghost of the man who didn't act. He had told himself he was a survivor, a pragmatist, a man who knew the odds. But as he looked at the moon of morrows, he realized that he had spent his whole life being a coward disguised as a realist. "Not this time," he whispered. He slammed the throttle forward, the Dust Eater's engines screaming as they hit the cloak threshold. The ship buckled, the phased field trying to tear the hull apart as they forced their way through. For a second, the world turned into a kaleidoscope of screaming colors and jagged light. Silas felt his mind being pulled in 1,000 directions at once, the bridge howling in protest. "Hold it together, Thorn!" he roared, pulling the ship into a steep dive toward the primary hangar bay. They erupted through the cloak and into the cold reality of the moon's surface. The thalassic base was a sprawling complex of white bone glass and obsidian, glowing with the sickly green light of Inquisitor Malakor's technology. Defensive turrets immediately swiveled toward them, their barrels glowing with plasma energy. "Vespera! The guns!" Silas shouted. She didn't move her hands. She didn't have to. She closed her eyes, and a wave of pure gravitational force erupted from the ship. The turrets were crushed into scrap metal before they could fire a single shot. The hangar doors, 20 meters of reinforced titanium, were torn from their hinges as if they were made of paper. Silas guided the ship through the opening, the Dust Eater skidding across the hangar floor in a shower of sparks and screeching metal. The moment the ship stopped, the airlock hissed open. "Go! Go! Go!" Silas yelled over the comms. Jax and the Echoes scrambled out, their plasma rifles spitting fire as they engaged the startled thalassic guards. The hangar was a chaos of blue and green light, the sound of explosions muffled by the thin, recycled atmosphere. Silas stayed in the pilot's seat for a second longer, his head spinning. He felt a sharp, metallic taste in his mouth. "Silas, you are bleeding," Vespera said, her voice soft in his mind. "The bridge! It is too much. You must disconnect." "No," Silas gasped, wiping the blood from his nose with the back of his glove. "If I disconnect, you lose the focus. You'll burn this whole moon down with us on it." "I'm fine. Just get to the cells. Get your sisters out." She looked at him, and for a fleeting second, he saw the depth of her fear. Not for herself, but for him. She reached out and touched his hand, her skin cool and calming. "We go together, Silas Thorn." They stepped out of the ship and into the heart of the nightmare. The facility was a labyrinth of sterile white corridors lined with glass tubes that pulsed with bioluminescent fluid. Inside the tubes, Silas saw things that made his stomach turn. Biological components, harvested organs, and the tortured, half-formed shapes of Xylari clones. "It's a factory," Silas hissed, his pistol raised. "They're not just making weapons. They're making a new species." They reached the primary containment wing, a massive circular chamber where 32 Xylari women were suspended in shimmering fields of energy. Their hair was silver, their skin starlight, but their eyes were closed, their faces twisted in a permanent mask of agony. Cables were buried in their skulls, leading back to a central processor that hummed with a deep, vibrating power. "Project Chimera," a voice boomed, echoing through the chamber. High Inquisitor Malakor stepped out from behind the central processor. He looked even more grotesque in the harsh light of the lab, his bone-glass armor etched with glowing runes of control. He held his staff high, the green light pulsing in time with the screams of the captive Xylari. "You are persistent, Pathfinder," Malakor said, his multiple eyes whirring as they scanned Silas. "I had expected you to die in the sector of silence. But it seems your resonance is even more durable than our models predicted." "Let them go, Malakor," Silas said, his voice level despite the agony in his head. "You've had your fun. Now it's time to pay the bill." The Inquisitor chuckled, a sound like dry leaves skipping over stone. Pay the bill? You humans have such a quaint sense of justice. You think that because you have found a way to stabilize a single Zilari, you have conquered the galaxy. But look at you, Silas. You are a candle burning at both ends. The very link that gives you power is hollowing you out. You have maybe 30 minutes of life left before your nervous system turns to ash. Silas felt a cold shock go through him. He looked at Vespera, and through the bridge, he felt the truth of Malakor's words. She had known. She had felt the burnout coming. "Is it true?" Silas asked, his voice a whisper. Vespera didn't look away. "I tried to shield you, Silas. I tried to take the weight of the resonance myself. But the bridge, it requires a host to ground the energy. I thought we would have more time." Silas looked back at Malakor, the fear in his gut turning into something else, something harder, something more human. He thought about the 22 people in the mines. He had been afraid to die then, so he had let them go into the dark. He had traded their lives for a few more years of breathing. "Not this time," Silas said again, his voice gaining strength. He didn't run. He didn't beg. He took a step forward, his hand gripping his pistol so hard the plastic groaned. "If I've only got 30 minutes, then I'm going to make sure they're the most expensive 30 minutes the Sovereignty has ever bought." Malakor's expression shifted from amusement to a cold, clinical curiosity. "You would choose to die for them? For a species that is not even your own? For a weapon that was built to destroy you?" "They're not weapons," Silas roared. "They're people, and they're my family now." "Because family isn't about whose blood you've got in your veins, Malakor. It's about who you're willing to stand in the fire for." He turned to Vespera, his eyes burning with a fierce, desperate light. "Vespera, do it. Release the resonance. All of it. I'll hold the ground." "Silas, no!" she cried out, her mental voice a scream of protest. "It will kill you instantly." "Then let it!" Silas shouted. "I'm a pathfinder, remember? I find the way out. This is the way out. Free your sisters. Give them back their names." The bridge erupted. Silas felt as if a star had been born inside his chest. The white light was blinding, the heat beyond anything a human body was meant to endure. He felt his memories being vaporized, the smell of the rain on Earth too, the sound of his brother's laugh, the taste of the synthale at Mariner's Rest. It was all being stripped away, replaced by the vast, cold, beautiful consciousness of the Xylari. But he didn't let go. He dug his heels into the metal floor, his teeth shattering as he forced the energy into a single focused point. He became the anchor. He became the mountain. He became the man he should have been 12 years ago. In the center of the storm, Vespera reached out her hands. She wasn't a weapon anymore. She was a goddess of the void. The energy fields around the 32 Zilari shattered like glass. The cables were torn from their skulls, the green light of the Inquisitor's staff being swallowed by the white brilliance of the resonance. Malakor screamed as the wave of power hit him, his bone-glass armor disintegrating into dust. The central processor exploded in a shower of sparks, the entire chamber shaking as the moon's foundations began to crumble. Silas felt himself slipping away. The pain was gone, replaced by a strange, weightless peace. He saw Vespera standing over him, her silver hair flowing in the wind of the energy storm. She was crying, the tears like liquid starlight on her cheeks. "You did it, Silas," she whispered in his mind, her voice the last thing he heard before the darkness took him. "You found the way." The world came back in pieces. First, there was the sound of a heart monitor, a steady, rhythmic beep that sounded like a distant drum in the fog. Then, There was the smell of sterile air and the faint, bitter tang of medical-grade Chronos crystals. Finally, there was the weight. The crushing, physical weight of a body that felt like it had been put through a trash compactor and then glued back together. Silas Thorne opened his eyes. The ceiling was white, but not the sterile, terrifying white of the Thalassic labs. It was a warm, textured white, the kind of ceiling you'd find in a civilian hospital on a free colony. He tried to sit up, but a sharp, localized pain in the back of his neck made him gasp. He fell back against the pillows, his breath coming in shallow hitches. "Take it easy, Pathfinder. You've been through the ringer and then some." Silas turned his head slowly. Ilara was sitting in a chair by the bed, her prosthetic arm resting on her knee. She looked exhausted, her face lined with new wrinkles, but there was a light in her eyes he hadn't seen before. Where are we?" Silas wheezed. His voice sounded like it was being dragged over gravel. "We're on the Horizon 6, Ilara said. "A medical frigate, belonging to the Convergence. We managed to bug out of the sector of silence just as the moon started to turn itself inside out. You've been under for 6 days, Silas. We weren't sure you were going to make the trip." 6 days, Silas muttered. "The colony... Velonis Prime?" "The blockade was broken 3 days ago," Ilara said, a smile finally breaking through her weary expression. "When the news hit the network that the Queen of Silence had liberated 32 other Xylari and destroyed the Chimera facility, half the Outer Rim went into full-blown revolt. The Sovereignty had to pull their ships back to protect the core systems. Your people got their crystals, Silas. Every last one of them." Silas closed his eyes, a wave of relief washing over him that was more powerful than any drug. They were safe. He hadn't failed. He hadn't let the dark win this time. "Where is she?" he asked. Ilara hesitated. "She's different now, Silas. The resonance changed all of them. But she hasn't left the observation deck since we docked. She said she'd know when you were awake." A second later, the door to the medical bay slid open. Vespera walked in, but she wasn't the woman Silas remembered. Her silver hair was gone, replaced by a soft, shimmering white that reached down to her waist. Her skin was no longer the color of starlight on deep water. It was pale and translucent, with faint lines of glowing energy running beneath the surface, like a map of the stars. But it was her eyes that had changed the most. They were no longer cold cobalt stars. They were warm, deep, and filled with a terrifyingly human vulnerability. "Silas," she said. She didn't use the bridge. She used her voice. It was melodic and rich, a sound that made the air in the room feel more alive. "You're talking," Silas croaked, trying to find a grin. "You're finally using those vocal cords. I was starting to think you were just shy." Vespera moved to the side of the bed, her hand resting on his chest. She didn't shimmer anymore. She felt solid. She felt real. "The link is broken, Silas," she said. "When the resonance peaked, the bridge burned itself out. The hardware in your neck is just scrap metal now. I cannot hear your thoughts anymore." Silas felt a strange pang of loss at that. It had been an invasion, a burden, a nightmare. But it had also been the first time in his life he hadn't been alone. "I'm sorry, Vespera," he said. "I know you wanted to keep the focus." She shook her head, a tear tracing a glowing path down her cheek. "No, it is a gift. For the first time in 1,000 years, I am not a weapon. I am not a weapon of the Empire, and I am not a weapon of the Resonance. I am just Vespera." "And the others?" Silas asked. "Your sisters?" "They are on the lower decks," she said. "They are confused, and they are in pain. But they are free. They are looking for their own anchors, Silas. They are looking for people who can show them how to be something other than monsters. Silas looked at his hands. They were scarred, the skin mottled with electrical burns, but they were steady. The tremors were gone. "What happens now?" he asked. "The sovereignty isn't just going to let us walk away." "No, they are not," Vespera said, her voice turning firm. "They are gathering their fleets at the Obsidian Reach. They think they can crush the rebellion before it spreads. But they are wrong. They think the Xylari are their greatest threat. But they are about to learn that the greatest threat is a human who has found his heart." She leaned down and kissed his forehead, her skin feeling like a cool breeze on a summer night. "You told me that courage is acting despite the fear, Silas. You showed me that life is a choice we make every single day. I have chosen to stand with you. Not because of a bridge, not because of a sentence, but because I want to." Silas reached up and took her hand. He felt the weight of the journey ahead, the battles that were still to come, and the lives that would be lost. He was still afraid. The fear was a permanent part of him, a ghost that would never leave. But for the first time in 12 years, he wasn't running from the ghost. He was walking beside it. "I'm just a pilot, Vespera," Silas said, his voice finally regaining some of its old, grit-heavy strength. "But if you're looking for someone to lead the way into the fire, I think I know a guy." Ilara stood up, her prosthetic arm whirring as she gripped her plasma rifle. "Then, let's get moving, Pathfinder. We've got a galaxy to win." Silas looked out the window of the medical bay at the stars of the outer rim. They didn't look thin or stagnant anymore. They looked like 1,000 small fires, burning in the dark, waiting for someone to fan them into a blaze. He wasn't the man who had stood silent in the mines. He wasn't the man who had hidden in the iron graveyard. He was Silas Thorne, the man who had stood still in the storm. And as he prepared to leave the bed and face the dawn of a new Dainganha, he realized that the most important lesson he had ever learned wasn't about flying or fighting or surviving. It was about the fact that even in the deepest, coldest silence of space, no one ever has to be alone. You just have to be brave enough to say hello. The transformation was painful, and the scars would remain forever. But as Silas stood up, leaning on Vespera's shoulder, he didn't feel like a broken man. He felt like a man who had finally found the way home. The path was open, and this time he was leading the way. The medical frigate Horizon 6 hummed with a vibration that Silas Thorne felt deep in his marrow. It wasn't the jagged, aggressive thrum of a warship, but the steady, patient heartbeat of a vessel dedicated to keeping things alive. For the first time in 12 years, Silas didn't wake up screaming. He didn't wake up reaching for a phantom throttle or checking his oxygen levels in a blind panic. He simply opened his eyes and watched the dust motes dancing in the soft light of the recovery ward. His neck felt lighter. The neural harmonic bridge, that jagged piece of thalassic cruelty that had defined his existence for months, was gone. In its place was a patch of synthetic skin and a dull, lingering ache that reminded him he was still made of meat and bone. He was no longer a biological fuse. He was just Silas. He sat up slowly, his muscles groaning like an old freighter's hull. The door to his private cabin slid open, and Jack stepped in, his red mechanical eye whirring as it adjusted to the low light. The big man was carrying 2 steaming mugs of something that smelled like roasted grain and industrial solvent. "You look like 10 kilos of recycled scrap, Silas," Jack said, a jagged grin splitting his face. "But the docs say your vitals are steadier than a dead star. How's the head?" "Empty," Silas croaked, taking the offered mug. His fingers felt thick and clumsy, but they didn't shake. It's quiet, Jax. I keep expecting to hear her in the back of my skull. It's like living in a house after the ghosts finally moved out. Jax pulled up a chair, the metal creaking under his weight. Yeah, well, the whole galaxy is making a lot of noise to make up for it. Scuttlebutt is that the High Overseer is frothing at the mouth. You didn't just break their toy, Silas. You showed everyone how the gears work. You showed them that a human anchor can actually balance a Xylari without turning into a vegetable. Silas took a sip of the drink. It burned all the way down, which was exactly what he needed. It wasn't just about the balance, Jax. It was about the choice. They spent 1,000 years telling those women they were monsters and telling us we were insects. But when we stood together, the logic didn't hold up. Ilara entered a moment later, her face set in a grim expression that suggested she hadn't slept since the escape from the moon. She dropped a data pad onto Silas's lap. The screen flickered with red icons, hundreds of them, clustered around a jagged region of space known as the Obsidian Reach. The sovereignty is pulling back everything, Ilara said without preamble. They've abandoned 15 border systems. They're consolidating their entire fleet at the Reach. They know if they lose the Obsidian throne, the Empire collapses into 100 warring factions. How long? Silas asked, his pilot's instincts already calculating jump times and fuel consumption. 5 days? Maybe 6, she replied. They're building a perimeter of gravity wells. Nothing gets in or out without their say-so. And they've started the broadcast. Every hour, on every frequency, they're showing images of Velonis Prime. They want you to know the price of your defiance, Silas. Silas looked at the screen. He saw the familiar orange sands of his home colony, the dome cities where he had spent his life trying to atone for a sin he couldn't forget. He saw the black shapes of thalassic cruisers hovering in the thin atmosphere like vultures. They won't strike yet, Silas said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. They're using the colony as bait. They want us to come to the Reach. They want a final public execution of the rebellion to restore the fear. Then we give them what they want, a new voice said. Vespera stood in the doorway. She was no longer wearing the tattered cloaks of a prisoner. She wore a flight suit of dark, flexible weave, her white hair tied back in a practical braid. She looked less like a celestial goddess and more like a commander. Behind her stood 4 of the freed Xylari, their eyes reflecting the same quiet, fierce determination. Vespera, Silas said, trying to find his feet. You shouldn't be here. You need to rest. Your energy levels were nearly 0 when we docked. I have rested enough for a dozen lifetimes, she said, walking to the side of his bed. She didn't use the mental link, but he could still feel her presence. A warm, resonant hum that seemed to synchronize with his own pulse. Silas, my sisters are awake. They are afraid. They have spent centuries as weapons, and they do not know how to be anything else. But they saw what you did. They saw a man who was terrified and broken stand his ground against an inquisitor. One of the other Xylari, a woman with eyes the color of pale emeralds, stepped forward. We do not know the way of the human, she said softly, but we know the way of the heart. We will follow the Pathfinder. Silas looked at the group gathered in the small room. A cyborg merc, an aging doctor, a fugitive pilot, and a handful of star-eating warriors. It was a ridiculous, impossible army. I'm just a scavenger, Silas whispered, looking at his scarred hands. I'm the guy who hesitated when it mattered. I'm not a general. You're the guy who stayed in the fire, Jack said, clapping him on the shoulder. And in this galaxy, that makes you the smartest man in the room. Now get dressed. We've got a war to win, and I'm not doing the heavy lifting without my favorite pilot. The next 48 hours were a blur of tactical briefings and frantic repairs. The Convergence fleet was growing. Every hour, a new ship would drop out of warp. Scrapped freighters, stolen luxury liners, and even a few defecting thalassic patrol boats. People were coming from the furthest reaches of the Outer Rim, driven by the rumor of the human who wouldn't blink. Silas spent most of his time in the hangar with the Dust Eater. The ship was a mess, its hull scorched by phased energy, and its internal systems held together with thermal tape and spite. He worked until his fingers bled, recalibrating the thrusters and reinforcing the shield generators. He needed the ship to be perfect. He needed it to be better than it was ever designed to be. Vespera joined him on the final night. She didn't say anything at first, just watched him as he worked under the ship's belly. The silence between them was no longer a cage. It was a conversation they were both having with the universe. "Are you afraid, Silas?" she asked eventually. "Terrified," he said, sliding out from under the ship on a hover sled. "My stomach feels like it's full of cold lead. I keep thinking about the Reach. I keep thinking about all those ships, all those guns. And yet, you are still fixing the engine," she noted. "Because the engine doesn't care if I'm afraid," Silas replied, wiping grease from his forehead. "It only cares if the fuel lines are straight. I've learned that much, Vespera. You don't have to stop being scared to do the job. You just have to make sure the fear doesn't get a vote in how you turn the wrench." Vespera leaned against the landing strut, her eyes looking out toward the stars. "My sisters and I have been discussing the resonance. We realized that the sovereignty failed because they tried to build a bridge of glass. They wanted something clear, something perfect. But humanity is not clear. It is a prism. You take the light and you break it into 1,000 different colors. That is why the bridge worked with you. You didn't try to be perfect. You just tried to be there." Silas stood up and looked at her. He realized then that he didn't need the neural link to know what she was thinking. He could see it in the way she held herself, in the softness of her gaze. They had moved beyond the technology. They had found the frequency of being alive. "We leave at dawn," Silas said. "I know," she replied. They stood together in the quiet hangar, two refugees from different worlds, preparing to walk into the heart of the sun. Silas knew that many of the people on this station wouldn't be coming back. He knew that he might finally join his brother in the dark. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't trying to find a way out. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. The fear was there, as constant as the vacuum of space. But as Silas Thorne turned back to his ship, he realized that he wasn't carrying the weight of the mines anymore. He was carrying the hope of a galaxy. And that was a burden he was finally strong enough to bear. The medical frigate Horizon 6 hummed with a vibration that Silas Thorne felt deep in his marrow. It wasn't the jagged, aggressive thrum of a warship, but the steady, patient heartbeat of a vessel dedicated to keeping things alive. For the first time in 12 years, Silas didn't wake up screaming. He didn't wake up reaching for a phantom throttle or checking his oxygen levels in a blind panic. He simply opened his eyes and watched the dust motes dancing in the soft light of the recovery ward. His neck felt lighter. The neural harmonic bridge, that jagged piece of thalassic cruelty that had defined his existence for months, was gone. In its place was a patch of synthetic skin and a dull, lingering ache that reminded him he was still made of meat and bone. He was no longer a biological fuse. He was just Silas. He sat up slowly, his muscles groaning like an old freighter's hull. The door to his private cabin slid open, and Jack stepped in, his red mechanical eye whirring as it adjusted to the low light. The big man was carrying 2 steaming mugs of something that smelled like roasted grain and industrial solvent. You look like 10 kilos of recycled scrap, Silas, Jack said, a jagged grin splitting his face. But the docs say your vitals are steadier than a dead star. How's the head? Empty, Silas croaked, taking the offered mug. His fingers felt thick and clumsy, but they didn't shake. It's quiet, Jax. I keep expecting to hear her in the back of my skull. It's like living in a house after the ghosts finally moved out. Jax pulled up a chair, the metal creaking under his weight. Yeah, well, the whole galaxy is making a lot of noise to make up for it. Scuttlebutt is that the High Overseer is frothing at the mouth. You didn't just break their toy, Silas. You showed everyone how the gears work. You showed them that a human anchor can actually balance a Xylari without turning into a vegetable. Silas took a sip of the drink. It burned all the way down, which was exactly what he needed. It wasn't just about the balance, Jax. It was about the choice. They spent 1,000 years telling those women they were monsters and telling us we were insects. But when we stood together, the logic didn't hold up. Ilara entered a moment later, her face set in a grim expression that suggested she hadn't slept since the escape from the moon. She dropped a datapad onto Silas's lap. The screen flickered with red icons, hundreds of them, clustered around a jagged region of space known as the Obsidian Reach. The sovereignty is pulling back everything, Ilara said without preamble. They've abandoned 15 border systems. They're consolidating their entire fleet at the Reach. They know if they lose the Obsidian throne, the Empire collapses into 100 warring factions. How long? Silas asked, his pilot's instincts already calculating jump times and fuel consumption. 5 days, maybe 6, she replied. They're building a perimeter of gravity wells. Nothing gets in or out without their say-so. And they've started the broadcast. Every hour, on every frequency, they're showing images of Velonis Prime. They want you to know the price of your defiance, Silas. Silas looked at the screen. He saw the familiar orange sands of his home colony, the dome cities where he had spent his life trying to atone for a sin he couldn't forget. He saw the black shapes of thalassic cruisers hovering in the thin atmosphere like vultures. They won't strike yet, Silas said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. They're using the colony as bait. They want us to come to the Reach. They want a final public execution of the rebellion to restore the fear. Then we give them what they want, a new voice said. Vespera stood in the doorway. She was no longer wearing the tattered cloaks of a prisoner. She wore a flight suit of dark, flexible weave, her white hair tied back in a practical braid. She looked less like a celestial goddess and more like a commander. Behind her stood 4 of the freed Xylari, their eyes reflecting the same quiet, fierce determination. Vespera, Silas said, trying to find his feet. You shouldn't be here. You need to rest. Your energy levels were nearly 0 when we docked. I have rested enough for a dozen lifetimes, she said, walking to the side of his bed. She didn't use the mental link, but he could still feel her presence, a warm, resonant hum that seemed to synchronize with his own pulse. Silas, my sisters are awake. They are afraid. They have spent centuries as weapons, and they do not know how to be anything else. But they saw what you did. They saw a man who was terrified and broken stand his ground against an inquisitor. One of the other Xylari, a woman with eyes the color of pale emeralds, stepped forward. We do not know the way of the human, she said softly, but we know the way of the heart. We will follow the Pathfinder. Silas looked at the group gathered in the small room. A cyborg merc, an aging doctor, a fugitive pilot, and a handful of star-eating warriors. It was a ridiculous, impossible army. I'm just a scavenger, Silas whispered, looking at his scarred hands. I'm the guy who hesitated when it mattered. I'm not a general. You're the guy who stayed in the fire, Jack said, clapping him on the shoulder. And in this galaxy, that makes you the smartest man in the room. Now get dressed. We've got a war to win, and I'm not doing the heavy lifting without my favorite pilot. The next 48 hours were a blur of tactical briefings and frantic repairs. The Convergence fleet was growing. Every hour, a new ship would drop out of warp. Scrapped freighters, stolen luxury liners, and even a few defecting thalassic patrol boats. People were coming from the furthest reaches of the Outer Rim, driven by the rumor of the human who wouldn't blink. Silas spent most of his time in the hangar with the Dust Eater. The ship was a mess, its hull scorched by phased energy, and its internal systems held together with thermal tape and spite. He worked until his fingers bled, recalibrating the thrusters and reinforcing the shield generators. He needed the ship to be perfect. He needed it to be better than it was ever designed to be. Vespera joined him on the final night. She didn't say anything at first, just watched him as he worked under the ship's belly. The silence between them was no longer a cage. It was a conversation they were both having with the universe. "Are you afraid, Silas?" she asked eventually. "Terrified," he said, sliding out from under the ship on a hover sled. "My stomach feels like it's full of cold lead. I keep thinking about the Reach. I keep thinking about all those ships, all those guns. And yet, you are still fixing the engine," she noted. "Because the engine doesn't care if I'm afraid," Silas replied, wiping grease from his forehead. "It only cares if the fuel lines are straight. I've learned that much, Vespera. You don't have to stop being scared to do the job. You just have to make sure the fear doesn't get a vote in how you turn the wrench." Vespera leaned against the landing strut, her eyes looking out toward the stars. "My sisters and I have been discussing the resonance. We realized that the sovereignty failed because they tried to build a bridge of glass. They wanted something clear, something perfect. But humanity is not clear. It is a prism. You take the light and you break it into 1,000 different colors. That is why the bridge worked with you. You didn't try to be perfect. You just tried to be there." Silas stood up and looked at her. He realized then that he didn't need the neural link to know what she was thinking. He could see it in the way she held herself, in the softness of her gaze. They had moved beyond the technology. They had found the frequency of being alive. "We leave at dawn," Silas said. "I know," she replied. They stood together in the quiet hangar, two refugees from different worlds, preparing to walk into the heart of the sun. Silas knew that many of the people on this station wouldn't be coming back. He knew that he might finally join his brother in the dark. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't trying to find a way out. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. The fear was there, as constant as the vacuum of space. But as Silas Thorne turned back to his ship, he realized that he wasn't carrying the weight of the mines anymore. He was carrying the hope of a galaxy. And that was a burden he was finally strong enough to bear. "I spent 12 years thinking that the cave-in at the mines was the end of my story. I thought that the moment I stayed silent, the best part of me had died in that hole with my brother. I spent a decade running, hiding in the dark, and telling myself that survival was the only thing that mattered. I thought that being a man meant being hard, being cold, and being alone. I thought fear was a rot that you had to cut out if you wanted to stay upright. But as I sit here, watching the light of 1,000 free worlds begin to burn again, I realize how wrong I was. The fear wasn't the rot. It was the signal. It was the part of me that still cared enough to be afraid. I didn't save Vespera because I was a hero. I saved her because I was terrified of what would happen to the galaxy if I didn't. I stood my ground because I finally realized that the things we love are the only things worth being scared for. We aren't defined by the mistakes we make when we're afraid. We're defined by the choices we make when we decide to keep walking anyway. I'm still just a pilot, and my hands are still shaking. But for the first time in my life, I know exactly where I'm going. We are the architects of our own bridges, and as long as we're brave enough to reach across the gap, the stars will never be out of reach. I used to think that the biggest cage in the galaxy was made of obsidian and bone glass. But I was wrong. The biggest cage is the one we build for ourselves out of the things we're too afraid to say, and the choices we're too scared to make. I spent a lifetime hesitating, waiting for the perfect moment to be brave, only to realize that the moment is always right now, right where you're standing. I want to ask you, out there among your own stars, is there a hello you've been too afraid to say? Is there a door you've kept locked because you're scared of what's on the other side? What would happen if you stopped waiting for the fear to go away and just decided to move anyway? Silas Thorne reached out and took Vespera's hand, their fingers interlocking as they watched the first sunrise of a free Dain-Gan-Ha. He didn't look at the screens or the tactical displays. He simply looked at the woman beside him and gave a small, tired smile. "Hello, Vespera," he said. "Hello, Silas," she replied,